Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome a return visitor to our stage today, Mike McIntee. Welcome, Mike.
Oh, good to be here, Steve.
Good to have you here. I should say, too, I was telling Mike before the show began that I looked back online and saw that about 2 years ago, Mike actually interviewed me on the Uptake, the program which he's a co-founder and producer of. I was interviewed by you on federal tax and budget issues, so it's kind of nice for me to be able to be sitting in the chair of the interviewer and have you as the interviewee.
It's always interesting to be on the other side of that, so this should be fun.
Yeah. Well, we want to talk today about the Uptake and about your career in journalism. And actually, one of the first things I wanted to ask you today was, when did you first know that you wanted to make journalism and television and radio a career?
Oh man, that's a good question, because I kind of fell into it a little bit. I remember as a kid I wanted to publish a newspaper for the neighborhood and learning how to use a mimeograph machine. I thought that was really cool, but I wasn't thinking about being a journalist. I was thinking about getting people's attention, so what I found out is the first thing you have to do as a journalist is get people's attention. So I guess that was maybe a good training ground for that. But I went to the University of Minnesota, sort of maybe interested in a journalism degree, and found that radio station I worked at there, and it eventually became the news director and general manager for, which eventually became Radio K, was a really intriguing way to get across information and a lot of fun doing it. And I think more than anything, the people who are associated with radio, television, and journalism got me more interested in the subject than the subject itself.
Mm-hmm. And you look like a young guy, but it may surprise people to realize you've actually been a radio and television producer now for over 30 years. Is that correct?
More than 30 years. I did my first radio gig in 1977 when I was just into college. And I worked at WCCO TV just a couple of years later. So I've been around for quite some time, but thank you for calling me a young-looking guy. I always appreciate that.
Well, you look younger than me anyway with the white hair. So, you know, it's no news to anybody really that there's really been, over the recent years, there's been a revolution in how people get news and in how the news is reported. You know, if you think back to the evolution of reporting and the news media, we started out with, what, penny newspapers 100 years ago or more. Then we went to radio, and then people started getting their news via television. And now we've come to a point where many people, maybe most people, are now getting their news off from the internet.
They're not getting it from the internet. I mean, they're getting it through the internet, but they're getting it over their phone from Facebook.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people, that's where they find their news. It's what their friends send them. And it's the
Twitters,
tweets.
Yeah.
Tweets, Twitters. I mean, the news business has become the business of engaging people, not to tell them the story, but to get them to tell other people your story, because they become the filters for everybody else. So it's become more complicated for people who really don't understand the art of storytelling. They've had to learn that you really have to key in on certain things to get people to pay attention to what you're doing. You can't just go out there and say, President blah, blah, blah did today, and expect people to pay attention to you.
Because they'll hit the change button
They'll hit
or go do something else, go to a different site.
Yeah, in fact, we had somebody in from YouTube, one of the people who works on the politics side of YouTube, and he said, you know, we have the 5-second rule, actually the 4-second rule. If you don't have something happening every 4 seconds in your video that's engaging people, they're going to turn it off. And you know, unfortunately, that's kind of the way I've always felt about things, is people, you got to engage them on some level, otherwise they're going to go away very quickly.
People have a famously short attention span in our country these days for everything.
Yeah.
Because
please don't touch that dial.
Change the
Pay
channel,
attention to
whatever
us
you
here.
do.
So
because people lead very busy lives, and they have a lot of other things they have to do too. So you have to capture the audience's attention and keep it.
yeah, you do. And to do that, you have to be relevant, or you have to appeal to something that they're interested in, you know, emotionally or intellectually, so that they're going to want to pay attention to you. Otherwise, it's time to take a nap.
So let's go back and talk about the uptake. Tell us briefly, what is the uptake?
That's a darn good question, because it kind of keeps shifting. We started out as a bunch of folks in 2007 saying, you know, the Republican National Convention is going to come to Minneapolis, St. Paul,
Or St. Paul, right.
to be precise. And we should do something. We should, you know, and this was a collective of people who were, you know, there were some activists, there were, you know, people like myself who were journalists and who were dabbling in podcasting and some video and those types of things. We should do something. And that over the course of a year, we had a conversation, and we finally came up with, well, we're going to cover it, and we're going to cover it in a way that nobody has ever done before. We're going to go out with cell phones and live stream what's happening. And this was actually something that only became possible a few weeks before the convention, but we had heard the technology was coming, so we planned to do that. And when the story at the Republican National Convention moved outside of
to the streets
with all the protests and what's going on, we had a front row seat where all the other journalists were literally locked behind cages that they couldn't get out because of security at the Excel Center. So we had the story to ourselves for a couple days before the rest of the world caught up.
And tell us, it wasn't necessarily your own reporting staff out there in the street, was it? It was citizens, so-called citizen journalists or citizen photojournalists who were feeding you these stories from their cell phones?
Yeah, we were using this unheard of service called Twitter that we were using to everybody to communicate with, to alert everybody else what's going on. Everybody understands that these days, but back then the news media didn't get it. We just had a Twitter feed running on our front page, and people self-assigned to go cover whatever was popping up, whatever was a hot spot, and either live streamed the video or brought it back to us, and we curated it and made sense of it and put it up for the rest of the world to see.
So what you were doing was really going well beyond just reporting a major event, a national political convention here in the Twin Cities, but you were changing the way that the story was covered. And so does changing the way the story is covered also affect the public's perception of the news?
Well, first off, it covered the news as opposed to giving you the prepackaged news that was going to be offered up at the dais of the Republican National Convention. I mean, yes, that was news. Watching Sarah Palin that year, that was news, but there was a lot more going on than that. And news is stuff that you don't know or you don't expect. And we were covering the stuff that people didn't know and didn't expect, and I think it became a more authentic brand of news.
And you raise a good point there, Mike. One of the things that I know my journalist friends get very excited about, we all know this now, those of us who consume the news or make the news can happen anywhere, anytime, and so you have to be prepared to cover it. So the uptake has evolved since 2008. You later went on to cover the Occupy Wall Street movement here in the Twin Cities, but also nationally. Tell us a little about that experience.
Well, that was very interesting because Occupy was actually primed to be covered in the way that we covered things, because Occupy was not organized in one particular thing. It started as one particular thing, though, which was people gathering in New York saying, we're not going to leave this space until something happens. We're going to occupy Wall Street.
And the complaint was, there were actually many complaints about financial institutions that had helped trigger the economic calamity of 2008 and later the foreclosure crisis and the collapse of the stock market and basically the disappearance of several $1 trillion of wealth.
Right. A lot of questions that people had, the 99% versus the 1%. All these bits of language that we now use to describe what was going on. That's the impact Occupy had, is they changed the conversation. They got the national media to actually talk about those things. But to get the national media to talk about those things, somebody had to cover them first. And we were called in because of our reputation. We'd covered the Coleman-Franken recount. We had we'd done the Republican National Convention. We were called in. We went to Ground Zero in New York, where this was happening, and set up a live stream to cover it, and brought in Laura Flanders, from Grit TV, and some other people to do a live broadcast of what was going on. We had we had people gathered around us to form a protective wall, because there was such a crush of people in the park to prevent people from kind of overrunning the broadcast. But when we also put out a call. We were running out of batteries. Somebody brought in a generator. It was just all sorts of things, using the network, the social network, to actually help us cover. And we were able to do successful live coverage that went out on Free Speech TV as well as on the internet.
And traditional media caught on to what you were doing, didn't they? They were trying to get access to your feed of the coverage because they didn't necessarily have people positioned in as many places as you did?
Well, what we did is we didn't have people positioned in a lot of places. Occupy had people positioned in a lot of places, and what we did is facilitated bringing all those feeds together in one spot, so you could monitor literally 120 different locations of Occupy in one spot on our website by just changing the channel with something that we hacked together. I actually hacked together.
Wow.
Put together so people could watch all these different feeds going on, and that's how people saw this was more than just one event happening in maybe my neighborhood or in New York. It was happening all over the place.
It was a national event.
And
actually, it became a global event later too, didn't it?
Did.
It went to Europe and other parts of the world.
We had reports. We had locations all over the world, mainly in the United States, but all over the world as well.
Right. Well, let's bring it back a little closer to home. Maybe not as dramatic as some of the events surrounding Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Homes, which focused attention on the home foreclosure crisis a few years ago. But the Uptake has become a regular presence at the state capitol. I know you brought us a DVD that we want to look at today, but before we get to the DVD, I want to ask you a question. It seems, looking at the background on the Uptake, that there were some questions whether or not some folks at our own state capitol even considered you to be a legitimate news organization. Tell us about that for a second while we get the DVD ready.
Sure, we had to fight. We had to fight to get space at the Capitol. We had to fight to get credentials at the Capitol because, well, frankly, other news organizations thought that either A, we were going to be listening on their conversations and telling the world what they were doing, or B, we were somehow going to be a bad influence down there. I'm not quite sure,
But they eventually came around and accepted that you had as much right to be there as the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press?
Well, they did after...
grudgingly?
Grudgingly. I think actually it's when Tim Pawlenty left office and Governor Dayton took office, suddenly the problems went away. I don't know if there was any connection, but suddenly we were able to have space at the Capitol, and we were not facing the same barriers as we had been.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So you did bring a DVD. Why don't you cue that up for us? Tell us what this is about.
Sure. This is the question is, there's so much going on at the legislature. There's literally about 16 hours of video generated a day. How do you keep track of all that stuff? How do you know what's going on? And we developed techniques dating back to the Republican National Convention that we employ, putting together a technical tool that we are trying to make available to more people, to more media organizations. And this is a little video explaining it.
Okay.
Hard to tell what that was, but it blew up. I don't know if you can see it from there.
Covering the violence outside the 2008 Republican National Convention is how the Uptake got its start. Ever since then, the Uptake has used crowdsourced video and Twitter to cover live, long events. These events can generate hundreds of hours of video, so we developed a tool that allows us to easily find the key moments. Tweets from trusted sources can now help us pinpoint important moments in lengthy hearings that can quickly be turned into edited videos.
It was not in my conscience.
It allowed us to quickly identify and find this key moment in a series of all-day hearings on legalizing same-sex marriage.
I blew my vote. And I'm imploring you, please get this right.
That video went viral, racking up more than 100,000 views in just 3 days. It's not the first time we've used this tool to create very viral videos. We also used it to create most of the legislative videos Minnesota's largest newspaper published last year. Now, we want to improve this tool, put it in the hands of more news media, and engage citizens to help the media cover the government.
Very interesting. I want to read you something that I came across, Mike. I was looking at Gallup Politics, and I found an article from September 2012, and it said, Americans' distrust of the media, talking about the mainstream traditional media, hit a new high this year, with 60% of people saying they have little or no trust in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Distrust is up from past few years when Americans were already more negative about the media than they have been in the years prior to 2004. And there's something else interesting that this report said too. It said Republicans continue to express the least trust in the media while Democrats express the most. What is your reaction to that?
Well, there's a couple things going on here, and you've got to bring up the obvious one in the room, which is Fox News. Fox News and the right-wing talk machine very much emphasizes that what the media is telling you is the left-wing liberal media and you should distrust them. And that message hammered home over and over again is what you're seeing partially reflected in that poll.
That if you say it enough times, people begin to believe it must be true.
It must be true. The other thing is there's a kernel of truth to that, though, and the reason being is so much of the news that we have today, despite everything you see on the internet, is owned by just a few corporations. And those few corporations over the years have, because of consolidation, have been able to get rid of a lot of good journalists and put them out on the street because, well, you're more than 50 years old, you're making a lot of money, we've got to downsize, here, take this and go away. And a lot of people, you saw it happen at the Star Tribune when they went through bankruptcy. You've seen it happen, you saw it happen in the television business. That's one of the reasons why I am on my own career these days as opposed to being in television news anymore, is the company I was working for literally went out of business because it became more profitable to give the bandwidth to another, an entertainment company. So those trends, plus the fact that people can go to the internet and get a lot of disinformation very quickly, kind of feeds into that. And I think that's what's all feeding that, what you're seeing there.
I want to probe this a little further with you because, you know, many of us applaud the advent of more citizen reporting and this type of new journalism that is in more places, covering more stories, especially exposing what goes on in government. Real important for a democracy like ours. But there have been some critics too. There have been critics of this new journalism who have suggested that sometimes citizen reporting is not always accurate and that because people are not trained as professional journalists, they don't have the ability or the training to ask the kind of penetrating questions that get at the truth. How would you respond to criticism like that?
Well, I'd say there's, again, some truth to it. And I want to emphasize what we do is not quite what you've described. What we do is we work with people who are passionate about something, who understand it a lot, and who want to be, quote, citizen journalists, but they're going to work with a real journalist, somebody like myself or Nick Coleman, who is also on our staff.
People with experience.
With a lot of experience, and we have more experience on our staff than a lot of daily, newspapers in small towns do. People, so we're going to sift through and make sure that we look at things and make sure, are we being fair? Are we being truthful? I mean, those are the two most important principles when we're looking at a story. Now, in terms of, we do work with people who are passionate about something because they can ask probing questions. They do understand the issue a lot more than somebody who is dispassionate. That's what I always get upset about. When people talk about, I want to have a dispassionate, journalists approaching this. No, you don't. You want somebody who, if they're dispassionate and they've been covering it for that long, they either don't know or don't care about the topic. And that's not where you want to be getting your information from. You want somebody who really knows what they're talking about. And if you've been covering it that long and you don't have an opinion, you're dead.
Well, you brought up Fox News a little while ago, and it's interesting, because from their comments about the liberal media, liberal bias media, you'd think they had no agenda of their own. It takes about two minutes of watching Fox News to realize they do have an agenda. They do have their own political agenda. Some would say MSNBC has an agenda. It leans a little more toward the left. And I guess a question I'd like to ask you, Mike, is it possible to be an activist and to still be objective? It sounds like you're saying it is possible to do that. It is possible to be an activist and be a journalist and be objective.
You know, they go together. They don't go together very well. That's the problem. You can be an activist, but I think you need to work with somebody who is a journalist to go over your work and make sure that you are being objective is the wrong word, but you're being accurate and truthful on how you're portraying things. Because
is fair the right word?
Fair is also.
And does fair include getting multiple sides of a story?
Fair includes telling the truth. And sometimes this is a trap that so many people get locked into. Well, we've got to go out and get the other side of the story. And just think of climate change. Every darn story you see in the national media, up until recently, always had to have a climate change denier, some kook who is going to say, well, 99.9% of scientists say this, but we have found this one scientist, here who is going to say the exact opposite. We're going to give him the same weight that we're giving this other stuff. Yes, you need to listen to the other side, but you need to decide what is right and what needs to be presented, not just go off and find some kook or some other side to just give you, quote, balanced coverage. That's not good for the...
But by telling stories completely and trying to get different points of view, really it's up to readers or consumers of the news to come to their own conclusions about what they find to be the truth.
They do, but you know what? When you... a good storyteller is going to give you perspective on what's happening.
Context.
Context.
Yeah.
If I can give you a bunch of facts, facts are not going to tell you the story. Facts are only going to give you, you can, I think the Talking Heads had a great song about facts, can be used for anything that you want them to be. What you need is somebody to put those in the context and somebody you can trust. And the only thing you have as a journalist is the trust you build between you and your audience, and when you violate that trust, you shoot your career.
So we talked earlier about the Uptake's coverage of the RNC convention in St. Paul 2008. We talked about Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy Homes movements that were national but also manifested themselves very much here in the Twin Cities. These stories were also covered by traditional media in the Twin Cities, by the Star Tribune, local television stations. What was it about the Uptake's coverage that you think distinguishes your coverage from maybe the more traditional media? Well, of those particular stories.
Of those particular stories, one of the things we did is we relentlessly covered something. One of the things with the media is that they're limited by their budget, and we're only limited we're limited by our budget too. But
I was going to say, aren't you a nonprofit?
We are a nonprofit. But
you rely on donations.
We rely on donations, but we're also powered by enthusiasm, and I have found that enthusiasm and people can do a lot of stuff that dollars can't buy, and that provided us with the volunteers to to do constant coverage at the legislature, to do constant coverage of we haven't talked about the recount and the coverage that went on with that.
Yes, you're referring to the recount in the U.S. Senate race, 2010, between Al Franken and former Senator Norm Coleman.
Yeah, in 2008, and also the Dayton recount between
2008,
Emmer and Dayton in 2010.
2010.
Yeah, so we gave that constant coverage because we had people who were interested in making sure that that the truth was reported and that nobody could say this election had been stolen. And
because there were some widespread allegations by the Coleman campaign, as I recall, that there had been rampant voter fraud in the Senate election, that all kinds of people, particularly in Minneapolis and St. Paul, were voting illegally, basically. And actually, the coverage of the recount, where we literally got to see the justices of the Supreme Court counting ballots and then ruling, making decisions about some of these allegations, and they basically said there was not rampant fraud. We had something that occasionally happens in American politics. We had a close election. We actually had a gubernatorial race in Minnesota way back 50 years ago between Elmer Anderson and Karl Rovog that was settled by 92 votes.
Even closer.
Turned out we had a Senate race that was even closer, but just because you have a close race does not mean that it was a fraudulent election.
No, no.
And your reporting at the Uptake sort of exposed the myth of the rampant voter fraud in that Senate race.
Yeah, that is, it's a story that the losers, in this case the Republican Party, have often tried to say, well, there was voter fraud, and they've tried to get traction with the media here in town, saying, something bad happened. And no reporter worth their salt looks at them and gives them the time of day, because they say, you know what, I saw every second of that on the Uptake, and it's archived here, and it's not, what you're saying isn't there. And being the publication of record in that particular case was something that no other journalism organization in town was willing to do, but we were, and that was a service that we were glad to provide.
So as our time's starting to wind down, I want to make sure that I ask you, when you look back over your career, Mike, and as we just discussed a little while ago, over 30 years in journalism, television, radio, what was the best story that you've ever covered?
Oh, wow. I mean, there's been so many. I mean, a lot of it, the last 5-10 years, there's been some incredible things that have happened. I mean, I've covered a couple wars remotely, but the things that had impact on me were the stories where people were personally affected, and I have to say it was probably the recount in 2008. It was a long, grueling story, but people came up afterwards and thanked me. And I don't remember getting that reaction from a lot of other stories. And it wasn't so much the story that impacted me as the audience did. And the conversation, because of the way journalism changed, we were able to have that conversation every day through the internet and on our live blog and then again in person. I just said, okay, what I'm doing is actually having a real impact.
Having an impact.
And you know what, that's all I think any of us can ask in life, is to have an impact.
Right.
And that little validation means a lot.
That's great. So let me ask you this. I know you're a technology geek, that you like to follow new and emerging technology, something very important in your line of work and the business that you do.
Absolutely.
What is the next new breakthrough in technology that you see on the horizon? Is there one out there that you think 5 or 10 years from now is going to change the way news is being reported or consumed?
I don't know what it is, but I think the only thing we can be guaranteed of is over the next 5 years, things are going to change just as much as they have changed in the last 5, if not more. I mean, you heard about the kid who invented something and got paid by Yahoo millions of dollars for summarizing summarizing articles. And you look at that and you say, of course, that makes sense. Let me see everything. Let me see a short synopsis of it. There's a lot of those things coming down the pike.
Change is the one thing that seems to be constant in your industry.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be very exciting to watch how this unfolds, especially when you consider how much the news media and the way news is covered has changed, as we've been discussing here, just really in the past 10, 20 years. Really remarkable. Mike McIntee, co-founder and executive producer of The Uptake, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy, and we'd love to have you come back on sometime in the future too.
Steve, always good to be here.
Thank you, Mike.